Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Gemini, the Race to the Moon, the second of the U.S. manned space programs. My name is Ken Stein, and I'd like to welcome you to this presentation. For the next 45 minutes, we're going to look at some history, we're going to look at some facts, we're going to look at some trivia, and maybe tell some stories as the United States continued its exploration of manned spaceflight. So sit back and relax, and let's take a look at Project Gemini. First thing we have to know, though, is where were we? Well, we had completed, or actually we're in the process of completing Project Mercury. Man had survived launch and re-entry, able to work in space, life support functionality, the capsules were working, and the programs and processes for launching had been worked out at Cape Canaveral. So we were ready to start the Gemini program. Now, a lot of people think that the space programs ran consecutively, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. But they didn't. If they'd run consecutively, we never would have gotten to the moon by the end of the decade. They actually ran concurrently. Mercury ran from 58 to 63. But when President Kennedy gave his "we will go to the moon by the end of the decade" speech in 1961, it started Project Apollo. But Project Apollo had some intermediate goals that had to be completed before we could go to the moon, and that led to Project Gemini. And as you can see, Apollo and Gemini both started before the end of Project Mercury. The programs ran concurrently. If we tried to do it consecutively, we never would have been to the moon by the end of the decade. So we're going to pick up Project Gemini, but remember, Project Mercury was still going on. We talked about the processes and facilities. So let's take a look before we get into the program of where the U.S. space program was. And it was in Florida, in a little box there bordered by Titusville and Cape Canaveral. And this is an aerial picture of the U.S. launch complexes for the space program. And we started in Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, these are the launch complexes over here. Launch Complex 14 and Launch Complex 19 are where the primary launches for Mercury and Gemini and one Apollo launch took place. This is the industrial area, where for those of you who were here yesterday, Hangar S was located. And this is called the skid strip, where the astronauts flew in and out of, and other planes brought in supplies. And down here, we have Cape Kennedy. Now, interesting, Cape Kennedy changed its name, the town changed its name, or excuse me, Cape Canaveral changed its name to Cape Kennedy in 1963 in honor of President Kennedy. Following naming convention, Cape Canaveral Air Force Station became Cape Kennedy Air Force Station. Well, 10 years later, in 1973, recognizing the historic nature of Cape Canaveral, the town, the Florida legislature changed the name back to Cape Canaveral, the town, and Cape Kennedy changed the name back to Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in the naming convention. But in the history books, you will read about launches from Cape Kennedy Air Force Station. And now you know where that is and why it was. The second complex we have is the Kennedy Space Center. Kennedy Space Center started being developed for purchase of a lot of land about 1961. We're looking at the modern Kennedy Space Center. Kennedy Space Center had the name Kennedy Space Center in 1963. Went from the Manned Spacecraft Center to Kennedy Space Center. This is the shuttle landing strip, which did not exist at the time, but was put in for the Space Shuttle program. Here we have the Vehicle Assembly Building. In this area here, that's where the rockets were stacked, as it's called, and built up. And then they were transported along this way out to launch pads 39A and 39B. And except for one Apollo launch, all manned launches in the space program have been done, to include the Space Shuttle program, have been done from 39A and 39B. Over here, we have the industrial area, and that was where all of the technical work was done. Home of the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building, where the spacecraft were processed. We'll talk about that in a moment or two. Right over here, this is the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Center, where some of you may have been. In addition to that, we have my house, where my wife and I live. Go outside and watch the launches. And if any of you have sailed out of or plan to sail out of Port Canaveral, it's located right here. So you can see, if we want to go for a weekend cruise, we don't have very far to go. Now, I talked about the facility. one of the key facilities, and one of the first ones completed on the Kennedy Space Center, was the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building. This building here you can see is a little bit taller in the back. That's called the high bay. That was a clean room, atmospherically controlled, where the capsules for the Gemini program were processed, all the experiments were processed, and a lot of the research was done requiring a clean room environment. In the rest of the building, we have all of the offices for the scientists, the engineers, and some of the administration. I had an office in this building for about 4 years. Now, if we were to move a little bit to the left, you'll see a road, and right to the left of that is where a building called the Space Station Processing Facility, completed in the late 1990s, and that's where all the elements of the space station were processed. And my office moved from this building here over to the Space Station Processing Facility for a few years. Now, in keeping with government bureaucracy, it wasn't too long before the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building became the MSOB. Now, it wasn't too long after that, given human nature winning over bureaucracy, that the MSOB became the
SOB.
The SOB. And it was known as the SOB, which NASA lacked a sense of humor about that. So it wasn't too long before it became the Operations and Shootout Facility, for which it is known today. So let's take a look now at Project Gemini. It ran from 1962 to 1966. The objectives of Project Gemini: long duration flights. It was considered 8 days was the minimum to go to the moon and back, and the maximum was considered 14 days. They had to validate that. Maneuvering and docking in Earth orbit. This was a critical requirement, not only in Earth orbit, but also in the lunar orbit. Extravehicular activities, or spacewalks as they're known, accomplishing those both in space and extravehicular activities on the surface of the moon. Active control of re-entry to precise landing, again on Earth and on the moon. Orbital navigation, how did they know where they were to rendezvous in orbit, and how did they know where they were in deep space, transiting between the Earth and the moon. And of course the training of flight and ground crews. Now a lot of people don't realize this, but you know that astronauts spend hours and hours in flight simulators, simulating their missions and all kinds of emergency practice. But a lot of people don't realize that mission control was right in with those simulations, doing what they had to do during those emergencies and during those flights. So the mission control people spent just as much time in simulations as the astronauts did training to work together. It's that kind of training and practice that in Apollo 13 enabled that to be one of NASA's most successful failures. And the flight profile for Project Gemini